say thank you to Interact for the opportunity to give this talk. And also to everybody who's here who's tuned in to listen to the fieldwork expeditions of myself and my partner in crime here, Mel. And the work we've been doing thanks to the funding opportunities we've been given through Interact and a couple of other funding bodies and our institutions as well. So I wanted to start, can I start? There we go. I wanted to start with this really beautiful picture of the Zackenberg River catchment, which is where myself and Mel have been working in northeast Greenland for the past 3 years. We are geochemists and we study how carbon cycles between 3 main reservoirs, which is the carbon in rocks, the carbon in rivers, the carbon in the air, and how it cycles between these different reservoirs. And while it might not look like it from this picture, up here at 74 degrees north, the cycle is pretty active, which is what I'm going to show you today. Yep, we want to show you why the carbon that flows through this river, the Zackenberg River, is so vitally important to our natural carbon cycle. And I'll be going through those things today. So as you all know, carbon dioxide, CO2, is a greenhouse gas, and therefore it controls the temperature of our planet and has done so for millions of years. Typically, when we think about carbon, we think about biology. We think about breathing and photosynthesis. And we also think about the anthropogenic carbon that comes from cars and industry. And this is why it's really important to distinguish between the different types of carbon and the timescales in which they operate. If we look at biological organic carbon on a global scale, so this is the Keeling curve, which is a very interesting curve. This is CO2 fraction, so essentially concentration in the atmosphere. And this is time going from today back to the 1960s. And this little loop here is the biological signal, the seasonal variation in CO2 around the planet. So this is plants breathing in and breathing out oxygen. So breathing in CO2 and releasing oxygen. And then this is placed on top of this curve, which is the blue one. And this is showing a steep rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, which is related to this anthropogenic carbon. But what you might not know is that the largest store of carbon on our planet is actually inside rocks. So you can see here, there's a massive amount of gigatons, that's 100 million gigatons of carbon inside the Earth's planet, which is absolutely massive compared to what we have in the oceans, what we have in the terrestrial biosphere and soil, and what we have in the atmosphere, which is actually the smallest stock of carbon, which means that it's very, very sensitive to any additional carbon that perturbs the system. And this is what me and Mel have been working on, this rock or inorganic carbon. And if we go further back in time, so this is the same here, we have the Keeling curve. So this is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Instead of being just a few decades, we're now going back 400,000 years. This long Keeling curve from anthropogenic carbon is what's perturbed after the Industrial Revolution. But before that, what controlled the CO2 in our atmosphere was the weathering of rocks. So this is the dissolution of rocks on our planet, which is responding to warming from CO2 in the atmosphere and leads into a positive feedback loop. So what this looks like, the rock inorganic carbon cycle, is summarized here. So while this is, it's a nuanced cycle and it operates on very, very long-term timescales, there are some key things that we need to take away from this. The first one is that CO2, that's carbon dioxide, dissolves in rainwater and also in soils. This forms a very weak acid called carbonic acid. And on the planet, because it's a very weak acid, it rains down and it breaks down and weathers, so essentially dissolves, 2 different types of rocks: silicate rocks, which contain lots of silica, and carbonate rocks, which are full of carbon. And over long time periods, this dissolved carbon and silicate from the planet's surface goes down through rivers and into the oceans, with some of the carbon that was originally in the atmosphere and became carbonic acid being locked up in the ocean. And this is that long-term carbon cycle that cycles that come from the atmosphere down into rocks, through rivers, into the ocean, until it's exhumed millions of years later, or hundreds of thousands of years later, and could be released either back on the planet as rocks or through volcanic activity. Yes, and there's a delicate balance between these different cycles, which has controlled Earth's temperature for many, many years. So when we look at the carbon cycle on the planet, it varies depending on temperature and rainfall. So if you compare somewhere like the Arctic here or the Antarctic or even the desert, This is very different from where we have places which have a lot of high relief, so steep slopes, lots of biology, lots of rainwater, where we have very active carbon cycles. So typically, when we think of weathering, these things are enhanced by the breakdown of rocks. So where we have lots of sediment generation, we tend to have lots of rock dissolution, and we tend to have a very active carbon cycle. What I'm showing here in this graph is the global sediment and water fluxes from each of the main continents. So for example, in Asia, we have a very active carbon cycle, as we do in South America, because there's lots of rainfall and lots of sediment. Whereas in a place like Australia, we have a quite inactive inorganic carbon cycle, and what's commonly considered in the Arctic to be an inactive inorganic carbon cycle. What I want to show you today is it is very much active. So over the last 30 years or so, monitoring of the Arctic has become increasingly available through satellite imagery and through availability to be able to get to the field. And lots of these satellite images have revealed that we're actually generating lots of sediment within the Arctic. This is predominantly because of glacial erosion, permafrost thaw, outburst flood events. And since the 1990s, the amount of sediment from the Arctic has actually increased over 50%, which means we're actually generating more and more sediment. And this sediment means more rocks which can be weathered and more minerals that can be involved in the inorganic carbon cycle. So back in 2017, a group, I think in Colorado, Irina Overeem et al., they went out and quantified the amount of sediment that was coming to the Arctic, and found that the Arctic actually produces more sediment currently than the entire African continent, even though the amount of fresh water is incredibly small, about 1% of the global total. So we wanted to know how is this sediment reacting, and do we need to consider it when we think of global carbon cycles and the way our climate is evolving? So another part of the inorganic carbon cycle, I've talked about silicate rocks and carbonate rocks. We've talked about physical erosion. So because we've got all these active cryogenic weathering, and we have this enhanced sediment flux, we have lots of ground up silicate and carbonate rocks, as I said, which can be weathered by this carbonic acid, which contains carbon. But there is also a less common but highly reactive mineral, which is present in fresh unweathered sediments, called sulfides. And when these minerals dissolve and oxidize, these generate sulfuric acid. And this is an additional acidity source in addition to the carbonic acid, which we have from the traditional carbon cycle. And this can also weather the silicate and the carbonate rocks that are coming from these erosive processes. Back in 2005, Damien Kamals et al. Showed that in a different region on the planet, they found the rate of oxidation of particular minerals, the rate of sulfide mineral oxidation, which is the reaction that produces sulfuric acid, is directly related to physical erosion rates. And if you have sulfuric acid, this sulfuric acid can weather carbonate rocks, which contain carbon. These carbonate rocks can dissolve, and they directly release CO2 into the atmosphere. So in the Arctic, if we have a presence of sulfide minerals, we have the ability to produce sulfuric acid. If we have carbonate rocks present, they may dissolve, and these could directly release CO2 to the atmosphere and counteract that from the long-term drawdown of CO2 by silicate weathering on the planet. So what we want to do is, our research over the past 3 years has looked to find a link between physical erosional processes, such as glacial erosion and permafrost thaw, with sulfide mineral oxidation and the potential for associated CO2 release. And when we first started looking at this, nobody had ever looked at these processes in the Arctic before, especially using the methods that we were using. And whilst this has been shown to occur in other places on the planet, the amount of sulfuric acid decreased very quickly because the amount of minerals were used up. Whereas in somewhere like the Arctic, you're constantly generating fresh sediment and new sediment, so you'd have a constant source of sulfide minerals. So we went to the Zackenberg Research Station, which is one of the Interact stations, which is located in, as I said, northeast Greenland, which is up here. The catchment is fairly small, it's about 500 kilometers squared. The Zackenberg Research Station is down here by the ZRS. The region consists of high topography as well as low wetlands. The river is predominantly fed by the AP Olsen ice cap. So this is actually not connected to the Greenland ice sheet and is smaller and therefore a little bit more responsive to global warming. There is a large lake which sits on the side of the glacier, which usually, not every year, but 90% of the time, undergoes an evacuation where it causes a glacial outburst flood event, and all the water travels down here. And during that period of time, almost, well, I think up to 90% of the yearly catchment, the yearly amount of sediment from that catchment could be delivered, which is a huge amount of fresh sediment, which could then be weathered. If you were to go, to give you a sense of scale, whereas my mouse is here, so on the far right-hand side of the catchment is roughly where Mel's sitting. If we look down this valley, this is this valley looking down here. So the ice cap is sitting behind here, and the water flows through the Zackenberg River down out to the fjord. And when the flood comes, this goes directly down through this valley. To give you an idea of the research station, once you fly in, this is the wonderful research station. So we have the sleeping arrangements, we have the food halls. There are several labs which are absolutely fantastic for the research that we want to do. There's electricity, the landing strip is right here, and there's also extra accommodation, I suppose, if you need it in the tents. This also gives you a sense of the river itself, which is incredibly milky. And it's very milky colored because it's full of lots of finely ground sediments. And the finer ground the sediment, the more likely it's going to be reactive. The whole of the region is underlain by permafrost, and there are some thermokarsts. So these have also been generating sediment as they've been melting, which tends to be old glacial till. And wonderfully as well at Zackenberg Research Station, monitoring has been going on for the past 20, 25 years, and they've been taking daily, if not twice daily, measurements of the chemistry of the river water as well as discharge measurements. So we've got a wonderful archive to investigate weathering processes as well as getting our own data. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the river, this is the Zackenberg River standing on the main bridge. Again, you can see this dark, milky, sedimenty color, and you can see the research station there in the background. Oh, okay. So the first time we went there, we wanted to get lots of different samples from lots of different rivers to get a sense of what the baseline weathering and rock dissolution was like within the region. So this is a very basic geological map where the different colors represent different geological units, which I've forgotten to label. But you can see the main Zackenberg River coming down here with lots of smaller tributaries coming on as well. So some of these tributaries are incredibly incised. They are small, but they are fast flowing. Whereas some of these rivers are lowland rivers. They flow quite slowly. They tend to have a lot more biological activity in the sense of grasses. They're grazed upon. So we'd expect weathering processes and carbon cycling to be slightly different in those regions. So we wanted to get we wanted to get a lot of samples with a lot of diversity. So instead of the main river, the smaller tributaries, wanted to get variations with slope, season. So what's the difference between the start of the season and maybe the peak of the season? And how does the chemistry of the river vary between year to year? Of course, when you go into the field, you've got to think about the safety. Of course, it's a lot of fun being able to go into these sorts of regions and just have an adventure. So we were always kitted up. We always took the rifles, the flare guns, the radios, always had our 10 essentials on us. But of course, we could also have a little bit of fun sometimes too. So we always had our flotation devices, which are obviously very important. The right type of footwear, if we managed to remember footwear for crossings. Dressing up as polar bears was obviously very important, although I think we had koala bear suits that year. And also eating lots of the ice that we could find when we forgot to bring water. And of course, after a hard day's work, having a bit of relax with a beautiful view out into the Zackenberg River. So what do we do for sampling? So when we're looking at the rivers, we want to separate the dissolved load from the suspended load. So within the water itself, we have these dissolved ions, and these tell us what is already dissolved from the rock sources and from the clay sources, or the sediment sources, sorry. And so we have to filter these, and we need both of these to be able to get a mass balance of what's happening with the different elements within the waters. So again, it's the same photos with the different types of rivers we are sampling. This gives you a sense of what the different rivers look like in the sense of color and amount of sediment. So these are 4 different rivers all taken on the same day. going from very, very high, rich in sediment to a very yellow sediment to something that's almost clear. And this was an amazing effort that Mel did. We managed to, Mel managed to capture an amazing glacial lake outburst flood event and didn't sleep for, I think, 2 or 3 days, collecting and filtering over 40 samples of 5 to 6 litres each. And so she's very proud there. So once we had got our samples, we filtered them through a 0.22 micrometer filter unit, and we separate the sediment from the water, and then we archive the water and the sediment separately. And then for different types of analytical techniques, we also pre-concentrate dissolved loads onto something called anion exchange resin. And this means instead of having to take 4 litres or 3 litres of water out of the field per sample, we only take this little bit of resin instead. And finally, we can also do other types of measurements within the facility, such as pH, alkalinity, conductivity, which are all fantastic facilities they have. Just to give you an idea again of what these sediments look like, this was during the Gloff event, I think. So you're looking at things that have lots and lots of bits of organic matter, like bits of roots and things like that, and lots of gravel, all the way through to something that's very fine, very clay-like. And at some points we had some very clean rivers as well with no sediment at all. So each of these is going to have a very different amount of minerals and the type of weathering processes that they have. So after we'd gone there, we went there several years, different times of the month, different times of the year, different years. We finished the field season, and the end of the field season, unfortunately, well, fortunately as well, also means the beginning of the lab season. So Zackenberg, you can easily ship all of your samples out. So these are all of our samples and some of our safety equipment that we wrapped up that arrived in Cambridge a couple of years ago. So once we get our samples, because we're geochemists, we need to look at each element individually. So we use different techniques using ion chromatography and different measurement techniques to be able to look at each different element that we're interested in. Sometimes we need to use these things called columns, and these also allow us to separate the isotopes of an element. So an element can have different masses, and so this will separate those as well. And just to give you an idea, this is the resin that we use to collect the dissolved load to analyze the sulfate from the river water to see if we have any sulfide mineral oxidation. And you can see the carbonate reacting within these whilst I was trying to elute the sulfate. So as I poured a small amount of acid on the column, the carbonate that was in the water, that was in the resin, started to dissolve and produce CO2 gas, which was really exciting. Okay, so we're trying to find out, is there sulfide mineral oxidation happening in the watershed? And whilst we found lots of sulfate in the water, it doesn't necessarily mean it comes from sulfide mineral oxidation. There are various types of sulfate. Not all of them affect the carbon cycle. So one of the end members that could be there within the source region is gypsum, which is a sulfate, and this has no effect on the carbon cycle. Whereas if we found pyrite, which is a sulfide, when this reacts, it produces protons and alkalinity. It produces acidity, which can weather these carbonate rocks, which could potentially release CO2 to the atmosphere. So using oxygen and sulfur space, we can see where our samples sit. So first of all, this is a global, I forgot to put the reference on, this is a global data set showing lots of different rivers from throughout the world, tend to be tropical, which sit between the gypsum and the pyrite end members. And then the data from the Zackenberg River is down here, which is very, very firmly within the pyrite region of this isotope plot. So we found an acidity source from sulfate. We now need to know what is the rock source. So we need to know what acid is being used to weather these rocks. We also want to know what the rocks are. So we can use different types of modeling and analysis of suspended phases as well as dissolved phases. And we can produce something a bit like this, which is a traditional what we call Gaillard plot, where we have riverine end members depending on the rock type. So there's a carbonate end member and a silicate end member. And these are the samples that we took the first year we were there. So we're weathering rocks that lie between carbonates and silicates. So there's quite a wide variety. So what does this mean for the carbon cycle? We've been to the field, we've looked at the acidity source, and we found that there is sulfuric acid present in the water. So we have sulfuric acid, but does that mean it's weathering carbonate minerals? This is the important reaction. So we have sulfuric acid, carbonate minerals. If these two are together, they can release CO2 to the atmosphere. So yeah, we've looked at the acidity source, we've looked at the rock source, both of these are present. So how does this affect the local carbon cycle? So there's a way and a framework that we can interpret this data. It is a bit complicated, but in a very simple sense, this, what looks like a very simple diagram, relates variation in rock source to variation in acidity source. So 1 here means it's all carbonate rocks, and 0 here means it's all silicate rocks. Variation acidity source means 1 is all sulfuric acid and 0 is all carbonic acid or no sulfuric acid. And then these lines divide or define space where the combination of rock type and acidity type either releases CO2 to the atmosphere or it draws down CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is based on a framework developed by Mark Torres et al. For the Amazon, and we thought we could use this too for the Arctic. So in the first trip we did, all these different rivers, we found that the tributaries and the Zackenberg main river, so the main river here is round, the tributaries are these other colors, all release CO2 on a time scale that is longer than the carbonate precipitation in the ocean. So in the long term, this field site is actually releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. We can take this one step further, and what's fantastic about the Zackenberg research station is that there is historical data which was made by the Greenland Ecosystem Monitoring Survey. And they've been measuring the same types of elements that we measured in the lab earlier. So they look at major elements to define, that we can use to define the rock end members and the types of acidity. So this is a video of how that source of acidity has changed from 1997 through to 2016. So I'll just play that. So again, what you're looking at is a variation in acidity against a variation in rock source, which you would not really expect to change because you're not changing location. The geology should stay the same. And then if you see data points in this region, it means on that particular day, the CO2 was consuming. So the river's drawing down CO2 to the atmosphere. And if it's in either of these two regions, it means it's releasing CO2. So almost like it's breathing, it's changing day to day. So you can see how this is varying over the last 20 years. And there is a lot of variation. I'll just play it one more time. There is no year where it's exactly the same. And then that's sort of another aspect of what me and Mel are trying to work out, is why are particular years more likely to release CO2 to the atmosphere than not. And just to give you a few snapshots. So in 2006, almost all the data points plot in the CO2 consumption. So in that year, that river was drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. In 2002, we had almost 50-50 release and drawdown, so it was net neutral. Whereas in 2009, we actually had more data points that were in the CO2 release to the atmosphere. So the next steps are why does this happen? But more importantly, what's the impact of this work? So this is something I just put together maybe an hour or two ago. But I was thinking, how can we put this in the sense of how it's going to affect our climate? If we think of positive feedback loops, we have CO2 in the atmosphere. As CO2 increases from anthropogenic impacts, the temperature of our climate increases. As the temperature increases, ice melts and permafrost thaws. As ice melts, glaciers are retreating, they're exposing more fresh sediment, which may contain sulfide minerals. These sulfide minerals generate sulfuric acid, which can then release CO2 to the atmosphere, increasing CO2, and we go through this positive feedback loop. And the same thing can happen to permafrost thaw regions as well. The big question though is how much CO2 is actually being released from a small river like the Zackenberg River. And these are still calculations that we need to make. But I think that if this process is happening widespread throughout the Arctic, this is actually quite a this is quite a big finding, because it means that as we're warming, we're actually adding more CO2 from our natural carbon cycle back into the atmosphere, which is potentially causing this feedback loop. Again, this isn't, you know, completely set in stone yet, and we still have some more calculations to make, but that's what it's hinting at. So in summary, hopefully I've shown that rock type, acidity, and time all affect Earth's natural carbon cycle. Increased physical erosion in the Arctic is causing sulfide mineral oxidation, which is producing sulfuric acid, which releases CO2 to the atmosphere when it reacts with carbonate rocks. We found evidence of this process in the Zackenberg River catchment, but this process is strongly dependent on the individual season and year, and tentatively could represent a possible positive climate feedback loop. Our next steps are to quantify the total CO2 flux, that's drawdown and release year on year, determine if this is significant on a global scale, and then in the future maybe ask questions about, does this occur in other Arctic regions as well? And with that, I will finish. Thank you.
I would have one short question. You mentioned that when you were following this carbon dioxide release or binding, there was also the change in the rock source. So how could you explain that then if the location stayed the same?
So maybe I said that the wrong way. There's very little change in rock source,
Okay.
whereas there's a big change in acidity source. So
Okay, so that's the major, yeah.
Yeah, no, the rocks should stay the same year on year. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.